You're listening to the Mile High Vineyard podcast. For more information about the Mile High Vineyard, go to milehighvineyard.org.
Morning. How are you this morning? All right, good. There's 5 of you that are good. The rest of you are like, what time is it? It's amazing how 1 hour makes that big a difference, isn't it? Especially if you have kids. Because your kids they don't obey daylight savings. No, they don't get it. No, I don't get it. So I'm not sure how they get it. But if you're new with us, so glad you're here with us. My name is Jay. If I've not had a chance to meet you, really grateful you came to be with us. It's always scary to come to a church when you've never been. So hopefully you feel welcome with us. We are starting this new series, and we're joining with thousands of years of church history, Lent, which starts Ash Wednesday, which was this past Wednesday, leads us up to Good Friday, which is where we remember the crucifixion of Jesus, and then, of course, concludes with Easter Sunday. And even from thousands of years ago, before Facebook and Twitter and cell phones and Netflix, the church saw fit to focus our minds and our hearts on what Jesus has done because we get distracted. Right now, I'm talking, and many of you are somewhere else. Welcome back. Okay, so the point is, you're like, what? He's saying something to me. Okay, so even if you're looking at me, you just zone out, right? I mean, we live in an age of distraction, and so even before all these things that distract us, the church saw fit to say, we need to focus in. We don't want to just wake up one day and realize, oh, it's Good Friday, or it's Easter. That's right, Jesus died for me, I guess. Let's remember that. But to spend an extended period of time remembering what Jesus has done. And so the basic practice of Lent is to give something up and take something on for this period of time. How many of you grew up doing something for Lent? Just from your church tradition, maybe. Like 8 of you. Okay, so this might be news to many of you. Historically, the church, it was a fast of some kind. So different kind of fast depending on the church. Fast from meat or alcohol or maybe even eating throughout the daylight hours or eating certain kinds of things and not other things. And so in that fasting, what you're doing is remembering the suffering of Jesus. How Jesus suffered on behalf of us. And it's that little pang of hunger you feel, you go, oh, this is a way of me remembering the suffering of Jesus. And then to take something on, a practice of prayer or study or solitude or service, again, to sort of enter into something that shapes you to become a different kind of person over these 40 days. So I'd like to encourage you, if you've never done something like this, even if you have, to do something in this Lent season. You could go with the historical tradition. Maybe you just skip lunch like every day. Some of you are like, can you live? Yeah, you can live. Now, I know people have different medical conditions. Please don't send me emails. I'm just saying you can do it, okay? And so maybe you do something like that. Maybe some of you have seen, if anybody knows people that just don't do social media for Lent? Anybody have a friend doing that? Or, they make sure to tell you as the season comes in on Facebook, you see all the posts, I'm not going to be on here. And even that, it's strange. That can take away a distraction. And when you go to think to do that, you think, no, I'm not doing that. And I'm remembering who Jesus is. So something like that. Some of you right now are going, Netflix, social media, food, this is too hard. So let's create a Lent rookie road. First step, it's a really simple thought for if you want to be a first step. You need a first step? Some of you are like, give me something I can actually do. Okay, here's something. Maybe as you drive in the car for this whole season, you just don't listen to anything. Silence. And you choose to pray. Does that work? Many of you are like, that's too hard. Is there something? Okay, so I don't know. That's the best I got. It's the easiest thing I could come up with that might actually do something. Some of you are like, for Lent, I'm giving up broccoli. Okay, well, great. What are we going to do? As you take on practices, can I ask, I've been asking a lot of our leaders, could you take on a practice maybe of praying? As you're praying, could you pray for the church? Pray for our times together and when we're not together, that we experience more of the presence and the power of the Holy Spirit. That's what I'd love to be praying for in the life of our church, because everything we do, we want to be animated by God's presence, by His Spirit, and be responsive to His Spirit. So could you do that? Would you consider that? How many of you are thinking, okay, I'll do something for Lent. I'll give something up, I'll take something on. Okay, more than the 8 before. There's some of you like, I'm not persuaded. Okay, that's fine, whatever. Do whatever you want. We're going to start. In the end, people do what they want. Okay, so we're starting this series. As you can see, Famous Last Words. We'll run all the way up to Easter. It'll be our Lent series, where we're going to look at the different statements from the cross by Jesus. Again, we're joining in some church history here throughout thousands of year church history. They look at 7 different statements or phrases that come from the cross as Jesus is being crucified. And so we'll look at those because last words are important. Often we want to sort of idealize what people's last words might be, and they're often not that great because they don't know they're going to die, or they're not prepared in that moment, so they say something like, I'm hungry. And it's like, well, that's not quotable. Or I'm cold, or something like that. But Jesus, as He's dying and is going to the cross, of course, has been preparing for this. If you read through the Gospels, you see the Gospel writers want to continually clue us in to realize that Jesus is looking toward the cross His entire ministry. He knows it's coming. So as He is being crucified, these words are very, very significant. And so when we look at the first set of words, I think we read them earlier, Luke chapter 23, I just want to focus on verse 34, where after He's been crucified along with the criminals, verse 34 says, Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing. While they're driving nails into His hands, He looks out over the crowd, He looks at the people that are driving those nails, and He says, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. This is Jesus Christ, the one who has done nothing wrong. He is not a criminal. He's done nothing illegal. And yet He is being crucified, and in this moment He says, forgive them. These words are so significant because, of course, they point to what it is that Jesus is doing, what it is that is being offered to us. And as a pastor, I have to say I'm a little concerned culturally that we've lost a sense of what forgiveness means at all. That we have any kind of a framework of what mercy means within our larger culture. I don't know how many of you read, there's a columnist who writes, a guy named David Brooks. Anyone here read David Brooks? If you don't read Brooks, you should read David Brooks. I think he's a fantastic writer. He writes for the New York Times mostly, but phenomenal writer. And David Brooks wrote an article at the beginning of this year that's called, it's titled, The Cruelty of Call-Out Culture, How Not to Do Social Change. And if you didn't know, we live in a culture right now where you can tweet or Facebook at someone famous when you aren't famous. You can tweet or, Insta at somebody who, you don't even know and would never know who you are. And it's created an interesting phenomenon where you can take on people for their inappropriate behavior without ever even knowing who they are or addressing them personally. You've probably heard me say, if you're in our church in the past, this would be like the Me Too movement, which I have said on our stage more than once that I find to be really helpful. I think it's great that men of power are being held to account for inappropriate behavior with women who have been powerless in the past, are now given a voice to say this is wrong and you should be held accountable. I think it's something that the church has been woefully inadequate and fearful to do, and it is remarkable that our culture at large is doing what the church has not had the courage to do. And so I am truly grateful for what I see happening culturally. And yet, Brooks's article is a helpful corrective to some of what's happening. Because as we're living in a call-out culture where anybody is accountable for their behavior, we often don't have any kind of a path for forgiveness and reconciliation. We have no means by which people can be restored to relationship and or be given something that even resembles grace. And so Brooks recalls, and obviously I don't have time to read the whole article, but in his article he describes listening to a podcast. If you don't listen to this podcast, it's actually pretty good, called Invisibilia, where it details this woman named Emily who's in a punk rock band. And as she's in this punk rock band, she's touring with this band, and one of her bandmates, who's a man, has someone tweet at him and accuse him of sexual impropriety. Of course, this is her bandmate. It's kind of awkward. They don't really know what to do. She doesn't really address it with him. But at the end of the tour, she retweets that tweet and says, "I believe the women." And what ends up happening is this effectively destroys this guy's life. He ends up being obviously kicked out of the band. Nobody wants him in any kind of other tour. His landlord doesn't renew his lease. He gets fired from his job, and his entire world falls apart. And Emily in the podcast recounts how much power she felt in that somehow someone had been held accountable for their behavior. Well, it's only a few years later that Emily herself gets called out. Emily she's 30 years old when she's called out. In high school, someone in her high school had posted like a nude picture of a girl who was drunk, and she posted in one of the comments just a little emoji. Just that was it. Didn't say anything, just posted an emoji. And so someone in the high school, now a decade later, says, "Look at what she did. She's part of a culture of abuse and bullying," and it dismantles her life. The same thing that she had seen happen to her bandmate happens to her. And no matter how much she apologized for what she had done as a high schooler, now in her 30s, her entire world falls apart. And she describes the awful reality of her life. Well, the podcast people tracked down the guy that called out Emily. And his name's Herbert. This is what David Brooks writes. He says, the guy who called on Emily is named Herbert. He told Invisibilia that calling her out gave him a rush of pleasure, like an orgasm. He was asked if he cared about the pain Emily endured. "No, I don't care," he replied. "I don't care because it's obviously something you deserve, and it's something that's been coming. I literally do not care about what happens to you after the situation. I don't care if she's dead, alive, whatever." When the interviewer, Hannah Rosen, showed skepticism, he revealed that he too was a victim. His father beat him through his childhood. In this small story, we see something of the maladies that shape our brutal cultural moment. You see how zealotry is often fueled by people working out their own psychological wounds. You see that when denunciation is done through social media, you can destroy people without even knowing them. There's no personal connection that allows apology and forgiveness. You also see how once you adopt a binary tribal mentality, us versus them, punk versus non-punk, victim versus abuser, you've immediately depersonalized everything. You've reduced complex human beings into simple good versus evil. You've eliminated any sense of proportion. Suddenly there's no distinction between R. Kelly and a high school girl sending a mean emoji. And Brooks concludes the article, I think, very powerfully. And again, I would commend this article to you. I think it's a very well-written, well-thought-out article. He says this: The problem with the pseudo-realism of the call-out culture is that it's so naive. Once you adopt binary thinking, in which people are categorized as good or evil, once you give random people the power to destroy lives without any process, you've taken a step toward Rwandan genocide. Even the quest for justice can turn into barbarism if it is not infused with a quality of mercy, an awareness of human frailty, and a path to redemption. The crust of civilization is thinner than you think. What Brooks details is how hurt people hurt people. And that there's a cycle of abuse that just continues to spin out of control because we're losing conceptually a sense of mercy and forgiveness. Now, when we take that frame culturally and we place that up against the words of Jesus as he, an innocent man, is being crucified, and he says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing. How do we make sense of this? Because when he says they know not what they're doing, is he saying they don't know that they're killing him? Like, they don't know the nails are going to kill me. They don't know what crucifixion does to a person. That's not what he's saying, obviously. What he's saying is they don't understand the scope of what they're up to. They don't realize the implications of them crucifying me. And though it should be held against them, please, Father, forgive them. Now, let's not make this cultural. Let's make it personal. All of us in this room have been hurt at different times in our life. Not just by systems of injustice or unfair realities, though we all have been annoyed and injured by systems like the DMV. It's more, we all have, right? I mean, this solidarity. But it's more significant than that. We've all been hurt by people. People that if we really just sort of got down to the core of us, we would say, they don't deserve to be let off the hook. They don't deserve to just be able to go on with their life as though they haven't done something. That in a very real way, you still bear the pain of what a father, a mother, a brother, a sister, a friend, a boss, an old pastor, an old boyfriend, an old girlfriend, what a child, a cousin, someone has done that you still bear the marks of, that you still carry. Can you think about that right now? Can you think, who has hurt me in a way that it comes up? It actually shows up in the way that is described in this article, that a cycle seems to continue and seems to propagate itself. You got somebody like, everybody here been hurt by somebody? Are you human? Like, do you have blood in your body that pumps? Because if you do, I'm talking to you. This is the real world. Listen, I want to ask the simple question, what is forgiveness? And I don't have adequate time to do it thoroughly, but I want to ask it, and I want you to think about that person. I want you to think about that scenario. I want you to think about that right now as I talk to you, because I want to press us towards what forgiveness would mean, because here's the deal. There's no other road to freedom. There's no other road to peace other than to learn to forgive. To know forgiveness and to forgive is the only road to peace. There is no other road. So, in order for us to consider it, I think it's important we ask what is forgiveness, to maybe start with what it isn't. Because I think people misunderstand forgiveness so thoroughly that when we say you should forgive, they make jumps in their mind that frankly make it so that either they don't want to or they don't adequately understand what it is and what it means to forgive. So what is forgiveness? Well, let me tell you what forgiveness isn't. Forgiveness isn't excusing. Excusing is saying something like, it's not that big a deal, right? Somebody does something, they go, oh, I'm so sorry. You go, it's nothing. It's actually not that big a deal. That's excusing something, right? I'm sorry I was late. Oh, it doesn't matter you were late. It's not that big deal. Somebody says, oh, I did this thing that was hurtful to you. Don't worry about it. It didn't, whatever. And you minimize the impact as a means of sort of escaping the reality. Does this make sense? That is not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness actually says something much more robust. It's a lot thicker. Forgiveness says, what you did was entirely unacceptable in relationship to me and in relationship to God, and I forgive you nonetheless. I don't excuse it. I don't pretend like it shouldn't have happened. It was wrong. And it shouldn't have happened. The way that I was abused, the way that you neglected something, that was not okay. And I forgive you. See, this is the way that God forgives us. God doesn't look at us and just go, we had a bad day. It's not that big a deal. He says, no, what you've done here is horribly wrong, and it's unacceptable, and I forgive you. C.S. Lewis, the great English writer, writes in Mere Christianity, writes this: to excuse what can really produce good excuses is not Christian charity, it's only fairness. To be a Christian means to forgive the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in you. This is hard. It is perhaps not so hard to forgive a single injury, but to forgive the incessant provocations of daily life. To keep on forgiving the bossy mother-in-law, the bullying husband, the nagging wife, the selfish daughter, the deceitful son. How can we do it? Only, I think, by remembering where we stand. By meaning our word when we say in our prayers each night, forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. We're offered forgiveness on no other terms. To refuse it means to refuse God's mercy for ourselves. There is no hint of exceptions, and God means what he says. Forgiveness is not excusing. Listen, sin is a big deal. It's such a big deal that God did not just look and go, it's okay. God came in flesh and had nails driven in his hands and a spear driven in his side. He was humiliated and tortured and died. And the scriptures say that God made him who knew no sin to become sin for us. Your sin, your punishment was placed on him. He was punished on your behalf. Sin is a big deal. And God paid the price that we might be not just excused, not just brushed off, but be forgiven fully. In that same way, then, God says, if you've been given this gift, you've been given something that you don't deserve, how then can you turn and look at someone else? He actually tells a parable like this. It's called the parable of the unmerciful servant. How can you be repaid a debt of $1 million, and then somebody who's offended you, you turn and go, no, hold them accountable for their $10 bill? He said, no, if you've been forgiven, then how much more do you need to turn and forgive others? If you don't, it's as though you don't understand how you've been truly forgiven. Does this make sense? So it's not excusing. It's also not demanding. Often what people say is, I would forgive them, but they haven't asked for forgiveness. They haven't changed their behavior. I would choose to forgive them, but they've not changed how they operate, how they've behaved. And if they could change, then I would forgive them. Does this make sense? Here's the crazy message of the scriptures. No one has to ask for forgiveness. No one has to change one bit of their behavior. You can forgive them without them ever admitting they did anything wrong. You can forgive them. You can let them go and bless them to be who they want to be and ask for God to bring you the healing you need and not hold them accountable at all ever again without them ever asking for forgiveness. Some of you are like, that doesn't sound right. Who will hold them accountable? If I am not God of the universe, will there be a God? Yes, there will be. There is a God, and you are not him. Here's a deep theological thought. Again, because where do we learn forgiveness from? We learn it from God. We don't make these concepts up. Let's think about this theologically for a second, okay? Ready? Is this real question? I want you to actually think about it. Does God offer forgiveness to everyone? Okay, some of you are like, I don't know, I'm so upside down now, I don't know what you're saying. The answer is yes, that's right. Okay, so what God did in Jesus is he suffered, he took the sin of the whole world upon himself, that all can be forgiven. Okay, this is not debatable, this is not a question, this is clear scriptural teaching. Okay, here's a harder question, it's a little bit different. Is the whole world reconciled to God in Jesus? The answer is no. There's a difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Reconciliation is the hard work of figuring out the terms by which relationship is restored. Does this make sense? Forgiveness is the offer, the blessing of turning loose your debt. Reconciliation is the work of saying, how do we not keep accruing that debt? And what are the terms by which we have relationship? The terms by which we have relationship with God is to receive the death and the resurrection of Jesus as for us. We have to still receive that. And as we receive that, then we're reconciled to God. In the same way, if we've been in an abusive relationship, if we've had people mistreat us, it is not a question of we forgive. You must forgive because you've been forgiven. The harder question is, how do we reconcile? What are the terms by which we enter back into a relationship or a business agreement or whatever? And that's a little bit fuzzier, but listen, you have to forgive before you can reconcile. If you move towards reconciliation without forgiveness, you end up just trying to beat them up, right? They're like, well, I mean, how do we reestablish a friendship? Drag yourself over broken glass. And then we can talk. Listen, if you've already forgiven, the work of reconciliation is actually pretty easy. Because you've already done the work of restoring your heart to receive and to bless. And then reconciliation, there's still some work to do, but it's different. Many people are saying, I can't reconcile, but the key reason is because you haven't forgiven. You have to do the work of blessing and releasing in order to do the hard work of reconciliation. Does this make sense? You thinking about the human still in your head? You remember everybody had a person? You're like, oh no, I forgot about them a long time ago. This does not apply to them. No, this does apply to them. And it applies to them because the only person that's in prison if you don't forgive is you. Here's the bad news. If this doesn't motivate you to forgive, I don't know what will. They're not thinking about you at all. But they're taking up real estate in your brain. And just like that article recounted, every new relationship you have, you read through the filter of that old pain. I mean, every time you go to interact with another boss, every time you go to interact with another man, every time you go to interact with another woman or another pastor, if you have not learned how to forgive, you read right through that same filter and you just keep repeating similar patterns because you're living out of a place of unforgiveness. And frankly, it blocks the way we experience the forgiveness of God even in our own lives. Does this make sense? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing, said an innocent man on behalf of you and me. So, if it's not excusing, it's not demanding, I'd say it's also not strength. This is not something you just flip a switch and suddenly you can do. I will grant you, this is a process. This is hard work, and it is a miracle. It's a miracle for you to receive the grace of God, and then it's a miracle for you to give grace. But it's a miracle that God does tend to do quite often and give you grace to do. Okay, so let's just skip to the hardest part, okay? Let's just skip all the way to the end. I can talk a lot about forgiveness, but I'm going to skip to the hardest part and give you an imagination for what could happen in your life if you truly forgive, okay? You're thinking about the person still? Okay. The scriptures are really clear that in order to forgive, you have to learn to pray for them. You learn to pray for them. Jesus says it like this in Matthew chapter 5. He says, You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward do you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus says, listen, everybody loves people that love them. That's easy. Right? Somebody walks up and they're like, you're great. You're like, no, you're great. Okay, so that's easy. Anybody can do that. That's what Jesus says. You know what's hard? You know what proves that you're someone that has tasted forgiveness? You know what proves that you're part of the family of God? You know what is like a blinking sign to a desperate world that is hopeless and just in a never-ending cycle of violence, of beating each other up? You know what shines out like a light is when you bless and pray for those who hurt you. People say, whoa, that's somebody who's been touched by heaven. Learning to pray for people who have hurt you begins to transform you. And when I say pray for people, I don't mean pray, you don't pray prayers like this, God, get them. Make them realize they suck. Okay, that is not what we're saying. Okay, that is not the kind of prayers. Because if you want to learn how to pray differently, you have hurt people. And if they obey the teaching of Jesus, they should pray for you. What prayers do you want God to answer of theirs? Do you want God to answer the get 'em prayer? Some of you are real sick in the head. You're like, yes. Okay, that's not, you don't. Trust me, you don't. R.T. Kendall wrote a book called Total Forgiveness. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read in a lot of different arenas, but definitely in forgiveness. I would highly recommend it to you. He talks about praying for your enemies, and he talks about how as you pray for your enemies, you go through a process. And he does them all in D's. He says, first, when you pray for your enemies, you do it out of duty. You know you're called to do it, so you do it to obey. So someone's hurt you, so you go to pray for them. Lord, bless them. Lord, help them. And as you pray, you kind of throw up in your mouth a little bit, And it's hard, right? It's like, oh, God, this is hard, I want them to suffer. But as you pray, you're doing it out of duty. He says, now after you pray out of duty for a while, you become aware of debt, is what he says, which is you begin to realize, I have been forgiven so much. I have hurt so many people. I have such a debt, and God has been so faithful to me. And you become aware of the debt that you owe, and so you can release someone else's debt to God, for God to deal with it. You deal with it, God. And then he says, and again, for some of you who've never done this, the rest of these are going to be like, that's some kind of weird lie. It's actually true. Everything I'm about to tell you is actually true. Then he says you can begin to desire this kind of prayer, because you start to see how it's setting you free in a way that you want to be more free. So you start to pray more out of desire for people who have hurt you. And then and this sounds crazy, you actually begin to delight in this because you enjoy this in a way that you think, man, this is kind of fun to pray blessing for people that have hurt me. I enjoy this. And then it builds a lifestyle of durability where you commit to be the kind of person that prays for those who hurt you. And I don't know how to say it other than to say it like this. You can do this entirely selfishly so that you can be free. Carrying unforgiveness in your heart is like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die. You want to be free. And you can build a pattern of prayer in your life that begins to change you. Okay, so if that wasn't hard enough, let's do this last one and we'll be done. Also, the scriptures teach us not just to pray for our enemies, but to bless them, like actually do things that would bless them. Paul writes it like this in Romans 12. Bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. And here's the key, verse 18. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Live at peace with everyone, as much as it depends on you. Do not take revenge, my dear friends, but leave room for God's wrath, for it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. On the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If your enemy is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. People read that and they're like, yeah, I want to put burning coals on mine. No, it's actually a sign of blessing. You're actually blessing them. I don't have time to describe it. Just trust me. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Did you catch some of the things he says there? Here's a way that you know if you are truly working through a process of forgiveness. If someone that has hurt you suddenly is in pain and you hear about it, watch the reflex of your heart. Do you immediately go, oh no, I wouldn't want them to be hurt? Or do you go, that's right, that's what happens, That's not good. That is really bad. If they do really well, someone's really hurt you, they're doing really well. You see them on Facebook, like, it's your ex-girlfriend, your ex-boyfriend, and suddenly you see them married to somebody amazing, and they have like beautiful kids, and you're like, you know what? You suck. This is not real. I know this isn't real. They're going to figure out who you really are. Okay, that's bad. That's really bad. Can you rejoice with those who rejoice? Can you suffer with those who suffer? This is a sign. And Paul is so direct here. He says this isn't just about prayer, though that is the place to start. It's about truly blessing people. If they have a need, you try to meet it. And it's a means of reversing the tendency of the human heart to curse. Back when we're cursed, we bless. This could be financially. This could be with an encouraging word. And it's a means by which you are truly set free. That's what Jesus does, doesn't he? He blesses those who hurts him. So, let me be really clear. Let me finish with my story. This is a life message for me. Some of you have heard this before, but when I decided to become a pastor, I went to my dad and said, I'm going to be a pastor. My dad said, no, you're not. I said, no, I am. He goes, no, you're not. How could you be a pastor? Like, you're smart. And that was a joke. I thought that was funny. And anyway, you're like, yeah, exactly. You're smart. You work hard. How could you be a pastor? And I said, Dad, I think this is what I'm called to do. My dad doesn't have faith. Not a believer. So right there, he just cut me off. He said, well, then you're not my son. And he went out of his way to make my life really, really difficult. And of course, as a young man, I walked out of that and went, you'll see, old man. You don't know nothing. I'm going to show you something. You just all this stuff. And it was probably about 6 months later, I was in a small group, and they were teaching Matthew chapter 5, passage we just read. And, pray for those who hurt you. And it was as though my dad was just right in front of me. And I went, I can't pray for him. I'm so mad at him. I'm so hurt by him. And I began a process of prayer. And then it was a few weeks later, I read Romans 12, bless those who harm you. And I went, oh, man. By the way, this is often why it's good to read the Bible. It can help you become a better human. So I read that and went, oh, man, this is going to be hard. I'm going to do this. And so I went over to their house. I walked in. As soon as I walked in, my dad left. And I went in and I shined all his shoes, set them all up, and I left him a note and said, Dad, I love you. I'm sorry I've disappointed you. I really want to have a relationship with you. And every week for 6 months, I did something to bless my dad. Make dinner, I fixed their back fence, all kinds of stuff. And each time he would leave the house or just ignore me, because I was dead to him. Each time I left a note. Now I'm telling you, it's hard to believe this unless you go through it, but about halfway through, something began to change in my heart where I went, this poor guy, he can't receive his only son who's trying to love him. How broken is this? This is so sad. Now, to be entirely honest, the first few times, as I shine shoes, he ignores me. I'm like, you know what? You suck, man. Like, what is, like I just, it's a process. It's a process. But after 6 months, he looked at me and said, we should watch an Ohio State game together. I said, I would love to. We just sat there in silence watching football, and I'm like, all right, see you later. But it was something. And over time, we rebuilt a relationship. I was with him last week, and he looked at me. We were walking along. He looked at me, and he said, Jay, I think you're one of my best friends. I was like, yeah, I think I am. I do. I think I am. And I was so grateful because I saw this is a miracle of God. Now, it's a great story, but the truth is, even if that hadn't ended that way, I want to forgive because I want to be that kind of person. I want to bless and release people because I want to be that kind of person. Because I want to be more like Jesus, and I want to live truly free. And the world at large is desperate to see people that can tell the truth and truly forgive. I wonder where there are those areas where you see patterns and cycles in your own life, where you see that you just bring the past right up to the present because you can't turn something loose. I believe that it's a miracle and that God can do it. It's a miracle that he is fond of performing in our hearts and our lives.
Thank you for listening to the Mile High Vineyard podcast. We would like to encourage you to respond to what you just heard by filling out a Connect card and sharing a prayer request with us. As a staff, we pray over those each week and would love a chance to connect and pray for you. To do that, please go to milehighvineyard.org/connect. You can also respond by being generous, as God has been generous to you. You can do that by giving online at milehighvineyard.org/give. We hope to hear from you soon. Thanks again for listening.